I know, I'm weird. I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate today. I'm not trying to make the case that there are only good things that come from a product delay. Obviously, I want my Aptera a month ago. I've been driving a lot more, and with my wife's new job, she wants the Model 3. I want to take the Aptera on my commutes to Tello and everything. I could really use one, like, now, even if it wasn't feature complete. That's why I keep nudging Chris McCammon every chance I get. Like, hey, you need someone to do range testing on one of those PI builds? I'll do it. Don't get me wrong. I really want this thing to come out as soon as possible. However, in today's video, I'm just going to be making the case as to how there are technically some advantages for it to take longer. One that's a bit more broad and one that I think is a lot more specific. So first off, I've been watching a lot of different electric vehicle startups in this space, okay? And what I can say fairly confidently is that some of the best performing EVs, a lot of the time, were late. They were not the ones that came out on schedule. And from my own experience watching lots of different EV startups launch, there's actually very little advantages to being on time. There's usually a lot of compromises to delivering the vehicle on schedule because it means that there were a lot of things that could have been ironed out or could have been finalized or fixed that didn't, for the sake of, we have a timeline, we gotta stick to this timeline. And that can apply to legacy automakers delivering vehicles without great charging infrastructure or without great software. But especially in the startup space, which Aptera of course is in, the two biggest examples I could think of startups that were on time, that delivered when they said they were going to deliver, that would be Fisker and Lordstown. Fisker actually well over a year in advance announced that they were going to start production and begin deliveries, and they hit their timeline. They hit their target because they were very loyal to it and they were stuck with it, and they just knew we have to deliver vehicles by a certain time, and they did. And of course, props to them for actually delivering, but we all saw how it ended up for Fisker. Obviously, a bunch of the software was rushed and not finalized. You could hardly get in the car because they had not adequately tested their key fobs to make sure that they were functional, and it resulted in a lot of people, I think would agree, killing the company because the reviews were so bad, because I think most people would agree the product was rushed. They stuck with their timeline, they wouldn't budge on that timeline, and they delivered an inferior product that resulted in a lot of people hesitant to buy them. No one wanted to own them. And as far as I could tell, the Fisker Oceans themselves were actually somewhat profitable, but because the vehicles had lost so much of their demand, so few people wanted to actually own one because of how horrible the owners' reviews were early on, they just couldn't sell them, and they had to slash their prices drastically just to move a little bit of inventory. But of course, the company could not stay afloat. And very similar thing happened with Lordstown. They stuck with the schedule. They said we were going to deliver by a certain point, and they did at pretty low volume, but of course the range was garbage, and the price was somewhat reasonable, but in a lot of ways, nothing really stood out about it to get that many people interested in it. But they were mostly catering themselves towards fleet buyers, but fleet buyers were not interested in such an expensive, inefficient design that maybe failed because they were so strict towards their goal of delivering by a certain date. You know, if they would have taken it back to the drawing board and said, let's not enter mass production yet, let's take another year to iron out our efficiency problems, try to find a way to make the vehicle a lot more desirable and have better efficiency, better range at a reasonable price, maybe more fleet buyers would have ordered it. There's all kinds of problems that went on with both of these companies that I don't have time to get into, but my point is there's not a lot of rewards in this space for being on time. I can think of several other companies that were very late on delivering, but realized that delivering on time was not as important as making sure that the product was good and right and worth it in the end, and that would be Tesla, that would be Rivian, and Lucid. All three of these companies had set timelines that they missed. At several points, Tesla announced vehicles hoping to deliver them by a certain time, and then they were a year late, or they had to push it back a couple of years. The Model S, from what I can remember, was easily over a year late, and the Model X was actually 2 years late. And you can argue whether or not they were successes, but the brand as a whole did realize that it's better off delaying the product to make sure you get it right than it is to deliver it before it's ready. And we can go back and forth on whether or not the Cybertruck was a success, but at least financially speaking, it's pretty much the best-selling electric truck in the world. And while a lot of the specs may have they've been a disappointment to us. The sales speak for themselves. They are pulling in more revenue than any other six-figure vehicle, and I'm pretty sure the Cybertruck is here to stay. You know, if they run out of people to buy the Foundation series, they're just going to keep lowering their prices, and they've probably got the margins to work with to keep it around. I don't think it's just going to get discontinued. They took their time with it, and they figured out how to make it desirable enough to maybe not appease every single reservation holder. I'm still sure probably 50+% of Cybertruck reservation holders canceled, but they still found a market that was willing to pay top dollar for it, and they delivered. And I think Aptera could be in a very similar situation where, sure, they're not quite delivering as early as we'd all like, but they're making sure that the product itself is good with the efficiency, with the solar charging. And I don't want to reveal anything I'm not supposed to, but I've been told Aptera is hiring a lot of software engineers right now to make sure that, you know, the battery management system and the infotainment and everything that goes on the mobile app side of things and with managing the car is legit. And I think taking your time to get those kinds of details right is crucial, because the YouTubers and the auto journalists out there are not going to pull any punches. So trying to make sure that you have the absolute best vehicle you can once you start delivering them to customers is a really, really important moment for the company and the brand. So yes, I wish I had my Aptera today. I could really genuinely use it, especially this week. I'm driving a lot more than usual, and there's so many situations in which my car is parked out in an empty parking lot in direct sunlight, and I'm like, why isn't it charging? Don't get me wrong, I'm impatient about it too, but I have to acknowledge and admit that taking your time with the product, at least historically, appears to have far more advantages than the companies that sacrifice the product for the sake of delivering it on time. Now, that's a more broad subject. My second point as to why specifically 2025 is most likely a much better time for Aptera to enter the market than earlier years. Like, I know originally they said they were going to deliver in 2022 and it got pushed to 23 and 24. There was a lot of fundamental redesigns. You know, when they first launched, they were not planning on using a carbon fiber body structure. They were expecting much, much lower volume and less interest, but once the pre-orders exceeded, 10,000, 20,000, that's when they realized they had to rethink their technique in order to catch up with demand. So there was a lot of redesigns there with the honeycomb structure moving to the Bink, the carbon fiber body. So that put in some delays. But my point is, even if Aptera got their funding way, way earlier, they got all of the money they needed to enter volume production. Let's say it happened way back in 2022. Well, I can tell you from experience, way back in 2022, battery prices, lithium prices were at like an all-time high. And I think it's very likely that Aptera wouldn't have been able to sell the vehicle for a very low price, and you wouldn't even have the argument of inflation like you do now, because obviously inflation has continued over the past 5 years. So you get a little bit of a justification, I think, for charging more than what they originally had on the website way back in 2020. But in 2022, you couldn't make that same argument for inflation, and battery prices would have easily been double or triple what they are today, which means that if they would have launched back then, I think this easily would have been a $45,000 or $50,000 vehicle. How many people would have canceled their orders to see a price hike that substantial? Probably quite a bit, and sadly there wouldn't have been much Aptera could do about it, because at that current state in the world, with all of the chip shortages and supply chain drama going on, they straight up wouldn't have been able to sell it for a very reasonable price. Now factor in, okay, maybe we say they figured out the supply chain issues and lithium prices started coming down in 2023 and 2024. Let's say Aptera got their funding, a year ago, everything needed for the interiors, the injection molding and everything, and they were ready to launch like last June or May or something like that. Well, it also would have been a giant charging infrastructure problem, because we've seen what happened with Rivian's vehicles and of course Lucid's vehicles, which I think the long range and efficiency emphasis has a lot in common with Aptera. But it's an even more challenging situation because the Aptera kind of needs NACS. From the very beginning, even on their alpha prototypes, they were like, no, CCS doesn't really fit very well on our vehicle, and because it's an auto cycle, we have very specific space requirements. We need to have Tesla's North American charging standard, and they were talking about that before even Tesla opened up the North America charging standard, which means even if Aptera secured their funding a year or two ago, they would have been stuck with the NACS port, and that meant that the people who took early delivery of them would not only be stuck with a CCS charging adapter, which up until recently barely existed, so you'd be stuck with either destination charging and only being able to AC charge the vehicle, which is definitely not ideal, or you'd have to go to CCS fast charging locations and use an adapter and try to get it to stuff into the charge port port with the giant Electrify America cables, which, by the way, Electrify America, especially right now, like if Aptera had delivered vehicles, is charging so much money. Like a lot of these stations are over 60 cents a kilowatt hour, which definitely eats into a lot of the cost-saving advantages of having an EV. Even with Aptera's efficiency, you'd be talking about paying pretty much a similar amount per mile to a Tesla on a road trip. And we also know from experience with Lucid and Rivian customers out there that relying on public CCS charging networks is not good. The chargers are crowded, there are lines, they are unreliable, and they get your speeds derated. Some of them even fried vehicles, like there were communication issues, and trying to deliver a vehicle, which we saw Rivian and Lucid do, that is purely dependent on the Electrify America network is almost a surefire way to ensure that your customer is going to be unhappy and dissatisfied with the experience. You know, the Aptera is targeting a 400-mile range, but we saw a lot of reviewers take delivery of the over 500-mile range Lucid Air Grand Touring, and they were ticked off. They were so annoyed that they had to charge at these terrible Walmart parking lots, and there were lines, and they were unreliable, and you would get slow speeds or stations that claim they're online when they really aren't. And of course, Aptera is a much smaller startup. They don't have as much capital as Rivian does, and thankfully Rivian had enough money to start building out their own adventure network. But still, even RJ talks about on podcasts and stuff, like when they first started delivering vehicles, so many of those early customers had to suffer through the growing pains of not having a reliable charging infrastructure. It's only just recently started getting tolerable thanks to Tesla opening up the supercharger network now. So if you have an adapter, you can use the supercharger network with your Rivian, and you can get decent charging speeds, of course. But with the Aptera, an adapter really wasn't an option because they needed NACS from the very beginning. And I think launching their solar-powered autocycle next year is actually kind of perfect, considering the charging infrastructure is finally starting to make more sense, because we're seeing at the beginning of 2025 lots of other companies actually adopt the NACS port on their vehicles, like Lucid with the Gravity, Hyundai with the Ioniq 5, and Rivian has also said they're going to be switching to NACS, as has Ford, and lots of other electric vehicle companies will now finally be able to access, over 15,000 supercharger locations without an adapter. And Aptera, even if they had their money ready a year or so ago, they wouldn't have been able to access the supercharger network. And because I think a lot of people care about the Aptera for the high range and that efficiency, those earlier deliveries, had they been ready this year, would have been stuck relying on the more expensive, far less reliable CCS infrastructure, and I don't think that would have been a great look for the brand at all. Because Rivian, at least, with all the extra cash they have to burn, can build out the Rivian Adventure Network charger and say, okay, we know you're unsatisfied with EA, so we're going to provide our own solution. But Aptera, there wasn't really any situation where they were going to have enough funding to build out their own charging infrastructure. So basically, Aptera would have been stuck in the same position Lucid is, with a demand issue. I don't think because the vehicles are bad by any means. It was purely because of the charging infrastructure. People did not want a road trip machine, of course, an EV with lots of range, that had a terrible infrastructure to rely on. There was so much negative coverage surrounding Lucid and the Lucid Air, and look at all of the negative news stories there were about Ford and the F-150 Lightning being stuck and stranded at Electrify America stations that were expensive and derated and unreliable. And I'm glad that Aptera should be able to leapfrog all of that drama, all of that early growing pains, because at this rate, if everything goes according to plan, deliveries should start around Q2 of next year. That means Aptera should, from day one, hopefully have access to the V3 supercharger network and never have to go to an Electrify America station. That's my personal goal. I hope I never have to go to one, but I think Aptera is avoiding a lot of headaches and a lot of drama, especially for their first early deliveries, by taking their time and making sure that the software is good, that the build quality is good, and at this specific time in EV history, waiting until next year when NACS, or the J3400 standard, is actually an open one that not just Tesla is using and lots of companies have access to. I basically just think next year around summertime is going to be the perfect time for a new EV startup to start delivering vehicles with access to that network, because trying to be dependent on all of these public CCS stations is a headache, it's a mess, and I think it would have resulted in a ton of negative Aptera news and unsatisfied customers. So I get it. A lot of investors are reasonably upset that the Aptera has been delayed so much. A lot of people think, oh, come on, when are you going to deliver something? It's been so long. But my point is, in the past few years, it really wouldn't have been a great time. With lithium prices as high as they were, it would have been far more expensive than it is today to build. And with the charging infrastructure being the absolute mess success it was, I think Aptera is going to avoid a lot of the headaches and growing pains that Lucid had to suffer through. And frankly, Aptera couldn't afford to suffer through like Rivian could, because both of those companies are far less efficient capital spending wise. Their profitability is still very much hypothetical, and similar to how the Cybertruck came out way later after the Rivian and the F-150 Lightning, but from what we can tell has a quicker path to profitability. I would not be surprised if Aptera, even though it came out later than a lot of these other companies, might hit profitability faster because they kept their spending under control and they didn't rush anything to market. They took their time. Slow and steady wins the race to a certain extent, right? So those are just some of the positive attributes of the Aptera taking their time. I'm very grateful that they're going to have supercharger access, and the rest of the industry is as well, and that lithium prices have fallen so much from those earlier days so that the Aptera final launch pricing won't be too outrageously out of control. What do you all think? Am I wrong? Feel free to disagree with me in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.